So I've gone and built this whopping workbench, and now I need to figure out how to attach the top to the frame. A lot of what I'm talking about today can be applied to much smaller projects, coffee tables or dining tables especially. Really anything where you've got timber running in one direction and then a frame element or a carcass element with the grain running in the opposite direction. The key thing when you're attaching a big hardwood top to a frame is that you want it locked down. You don't want it to wobble around and you want it to stay exactly where you put it, but you've also got to allow the grain to move independently on the top than from the frame. Because if you lock it down too tight and you don't allow for that grain movement, what could end up happening is, depending on how you've attached it, you're either going to split the carcass with the force created by the expansion of the grain on the top, or you could potentially split the top itself by the contracting forces if it's locked down too tight to the frame. There's a whole number of off-the-shelf little metal fasteners that you can use for jobs like this. I'm going to start with the smallest ones, which are definitely not appropriate for a workbench this size, but would be very appropriate for a smaller coffee table, that sort of thing. These little figure-8 clips, as I call them, I hope that's what they're called commonly, are a really simple way of attaching the top to the carcass or to the frame. And what they allow the timber to do is to essentially swivel on those two screw points. The way that this gets attached is you recess a little Forstner cavity in your frame, generally in the frame. You screw that little figure-8 clip in there, imagining your frame is, sitting like this in the real world, and then the top is going to sit down on top of that. And then you attach your top and screw up into the top, and that little figure-8 can swivel back and forth if the top needs to expand and contract. Now, you need to figure out where you're going to put that to allow for that contraction. If you put one of these on your side rail, the force that's going to be going into your side rail is actually perpendicular to the rail itself. Basically, as the tabletop expands, it could potentially push that edge into the rail or further away. So if you set this figure-8 exactly perpendicular to the rail, it's not actually going to allow for that movement. So you need to be able to offset it slightly on a diagonal so that it can have a tiny bit of movement backwards and forwards. If you were going to install these figure-8 clips on the end pieces rather than the side rails, then they're naturally going to allow that sideways movement without having to diagonally offset them, because that's the direction that the timber wants to move. So that's basically it for the figure-8 clips. Make sure your Forstner hole is large enough to allow for that sideways movement. They're better installed on end rails than side rails because they move better in that direction. They're quick and easy to install, but they're pretty light duty, so better for a smaller object. The next one I'm going to talk about is commonly called a Z-clip. It's a similar situation. You've got a little metal clip that in this case gets screwed directly to the underside of your actual table or your bench, and then it's got a little tongue that sits in a slot in your rail. So you have to cut that slot in your rail. The easiest way to do that is with a biscuit jointer. They're generally the right size for a standard number 2 biscuit jointer or slot cutter. You could also do it with a fine drill bit and a chisel if you have no other biscuit jointer or slot cutter operation, but I'm going to assume that you do. Basically, the only thing that you need to consider is the height of the slot that you've cut. These are designed with a Z shape so that, imagine that this is upside down. We're going to attach it to this bench top here. You want to make sure that your Z-clip, when it's firmly inserted in the slot, sits a tiny bit up off that tabletop. This isn't quite touching here. And what that allows you to do is when you screw that down, it's actually applying a bunch of force to keep that tabletop in the right location. These are a ton stronger than the figure-8 clips. So with a lot of these, you could attach a bench top of this size. They're really suitable for a dining table, but you might want to put, 8 situated around the frame. In terms of the direction that these things can move, because they only have one screw point in the table, they can pivot slightly, which allows them to have some lateral movement. And that tongue can also slide a tiny bit in and out of the slot. Now, you don't want it to slide too far out or it's going to disconnect, but that means you can attach them on the side rails or the end rails. I'd say you're probably going to get a firmer connection if you put them on the end rails because you have less chance of the expansion actually pulling the tongue out of that slot. In terms of the height of that slot, mine looks like it's around 12 mil off the bottom, but just as long as when you put that in, you've got a little bit of space between the clip and the table so that when you drive that in with a screw, it really pulls it down to the table. Advantages, pretty easy if you have a biscuit cutter, fairly neat. They're not super fancy, so if you've built something really nice, you might want to look at one of the timber fasteners that I'm going to be talking about next. They're fairly strong. They're certainly stronger than a figure 8 clip. Good, fairly quick and easy option for dining tables, coffee tables, and if you use a ton of them, something like this as well. The next fastening method I'm going to talk about are commonly called timber buttons. They're a piece that you need to make yourself, but they're basically a Z-clip. It functions in exactly the same way in basically every respect, except you need a much larger slot. I've built these buttons, and these are actually what I'm going to use on this bench. I built these so that the tongue is the same size as my 12 mil domino slot cutter. That's, lucky for me that I have a domino cutter. If you don't, there are plenty of ways to cut a slot that will accept something like this. A Forstner bit, a router bit, you just need to figure that out yourself. I'm sure you're capable of that. But the principle is the same. You want a slot that allows the tongue to move in and out and a little bit of lateral motion, depending on where you're going to put these, on the rails or on the end. And then you're going to screw this button directly to the underside of your bench top. So that gives you a really firm fasten. It gives you the movement that we require. And it also looks a little bit nicer than putting a Z-clip in there. So I'd install something like this. Well, I will be installing this with these bugle screws. I've recessed the heads right down so I get a good fasten into the table, and they're nice and hidden. They're not going to be seen, but it is one of those pride things about making something timber that connects this big beautiful thing together that looks quite nice. So that's an option too. Last thing to consider is, just like a Z-clip, you actually want this slot to be slightly higher than the tongue so that it doesn't sit perfectly flat on the table. And what that means is when you drive this screw in home, it's really going to hug that frame to the tabletop. So in my situation, I'm actually going to put 4 of these on this bench top to start with. I think that'll be enough, but if I need to put more, I can. And I'm going to put them on the end rails. So there'll be 1 here, 1 at the other side, 2 down that end. You need to make sure that you're not putting them right up against your side rails, because that is going to hinder that lateral sideways grain movement that we're trying to allow for. So a few mils off the side rails, and then you can push them hard into the end rails, because we're not going to have timber movement in that direction. The rails are going to expand at the same rate as our bench top is in that long direction. So we don't need to allow for movement in that way. The way you would go about fastening these is you would first of all put your domino slots or router slots in the rails, or in my case, in the end rails. Make sure that they're in the right location. Then you put your tabletop down, arrange it so that all of your edges are exactly where you want it to be. Make sure it's right where you want it to be, because this is the final attachment. You will then clamp it right down, push these into the slot, and then screw them in, pre-drill and screw them in nice and tight. That means that it's going to be held firmly. If it needs to, that expansion force, which is surprisingly strong, will allow these little buttons to twist side to side. And then, if you need to take it off to move the top separately from the base, which, to move this, you really do have to take it apart. Then it's pretty easy to unscrew. Make sure with your timber buttons, the grain direction is running long ways through the button, because that's where your strength is. If you do it the other way, really defeat the purpose. So that's a nice way to do this using timber buttons. Two more ways that you could potentially attach a tabletop or a bench top to the rails. These are not things I'm going to do, but I thought they're worth mentioning anyway. If your rails are narrow enough, or not too high, mine are 140, so I can't use this. You could potentially drill straight through the rail up into the tabletop. But you need to make sure that you've allowed for that expansion and contraction. So depending whether you're putting these on your side rails or your end rails, you need to not drill a hole, but actually a slot, or you could potentially get away with just an enlarged hole that allowed that screw to move back and forth with the bench top. So if this was in your end rail, like this one here, you would need the slot to run along the grain of the timber, because that's the direction that the table wants to move. If you were going to put this in your side rail, you would actually need the slot to be running cross grain in your rail, again to allow for the movement of the top. The way you would do that is you drill the hole first, and then you would probably enlarge that hole with a router bit to make that hole a very long slot, or like I said, you could potentially get away with just an enlarged hole. It's up to you. That is one way of doing it. It just wasn't viable in my situation because the rails are too tall. The last method that I want to talk about, it's a little bit more complicated, but if you were building a piece that you were determined to have no metal in, this is a way that you can do it. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but basically what you're going to be doing is fastening, gluing a piece of timber to the tabletop. There are a variety of ways of doing this, but this is one way. Gluing a piece of timber to the tabletop that it's going to sit flush with the end rail, and then you're going to use a dowel through the end rail and into that piece of timber to fasten the top down. Couple of things to keep in mind. When you're gluing your piece to the tabletop, make sure the grain is running in the same direction, or it defeats the whole purpose. If you have good glue surface area, the grain's in the same direction, you'll get really good, strong fastening. And the other thing to keep in mind is it's worth, when you're drilling the hole for the dowel, making the hole in the rail slightly lower than the hole in the piece that's attached to the top, so that when you drive it in, it's really pulling that tabletop down. This is kind of a traditional method of attaching big old bar tables, for instance, and they would generally have one giant pin in the center of each end rail, and that dowel or that pin would have a knob that you could wiggle, twist and pull out so that you could remove it, take the table off, and then move the entire table. There are similar ways that you could do that and put, rather than just one in each end rail, you could put two in each end rail, but again, you've just got to allow for that movement. There are a couple other ways using dowels, but you can explore that on your own. But just know that if you are determined to not use any metal, you can, if you're smart about it, use big timber dowels. You just need to know that it's potentially really tough to get them in and out once the timber is expanded and contracted, and depending on the moisture in the room. In this situation, these buttons are going to be perfect for this bench. They're going to look nice. It's easy for me to take in and out. They're not going to get jammed in there, and I know I'm going to get a really firm fixing exactly where I want.